welcome back to our second panel of the morning. This is the exciting time where we get to discuss how to actually do all these things that we're talking about. And I think that we're going to have a very lively discussion about what's worked, maybe what hasn't worked, and more than anything about the opportunities for engaging Cuba. My name is Lydia Barraza, and I'm the Deputy Public Affairs Officer at the US Embassy. It's lovely to say that, in Havana. I oversee many of the educational programs that we have at the embassy, distance learning programs, the internet centers, and many of the academic and cultural exchanges that you all are interested in. So I've met many of you, and I'm delighted to see you again in a totally different environment in Washington, D.C. And I've received emails from even more of you in my beast that is my email inbox. And we are delighted from the State Department and from the U.S. Embassy in Havana to see the interest in furthering cultural and academic exchanges in Cuba. So, before we get started, I want for all of our panelists to be aware of who is in the audience and the types of experience that each of you have. So let's go through a little bit and talk about, with a show of hands, where you're all coming from. So how many of you are affiliated with a university? Okay. This is good for networking also, for our networking hour after we finish. How many of you are affiliated with an NGO or a nonprofit organization? Okay. How many of you come from a think tank? Okay. And Department of State, my colleagues who work so hard to make all of this happen. Great, welcome. I'm curious also about your experience in Cuba. How many have traveled to Cuba? Woo, wonderful. Taking advantage of the new regs and less paperwork. How many of you have been working in Cuba for over 5 years? Okay, over 10 years? Way back when? Any over 15 years? Great, great, wonderful. Excellent to see you. Those of you who haven't yet had experience, I'm curious, just shout it out. What kind of exchanges are you thinking about? Student exchanges?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Faculty exchanges?
Yes.
Practical agricultural exchange.
Okay. Cultural, okay, great. Oh, artists. Oh, how many artist type exchanges do we have in here? Okay. All right, great. Great. We really have a diversity of participants, and I think that this will lend itself to the discussion and the diversity of the panelists that we have here. So this morning we talked about the policy, the new regulations that are in place that allow for greater opportunities of exchange between American citizens and Cuban citizens. How do we move forward on a practical level, the President Obama's policy on Cuba and further engagement, and moving to a Cuba where Cubans will decide their own future. And a big part of that is exposure to the outside world and exposure to the United States and American values. And you all are the people that will provide that exposure and that connectivity. There are challenges making two-way exchanges rather than just one way. And we'll talk about, our panelists will be addressing those. I want to go ahead and introduce our first panelist, Jennifer Attal Allen. She's been working in the field of education abroad for 25 years. She founded Academic Programs International in 1997 with 3 other women and has served as the president of API since then. They currently send over 3,800 individuals to over 20 countries. And I have personally hosted in my residence her students who came to Cuba last semester to study at the University of Havana. So I've seen on the ground the impact that a study abroad, study in Cuba particularly, has on college students. So I will go ahead and hand it over to her to start the panel.
Hello, everyone. I've been asked to talk basically about the hows and whys and the best practices and standards of starting a program and operating a program in Cuba. And I am very, very pleased to say that the student exchange in the program study abroad is amazingly active, and we have more and more interest every day. I'd like to give you a little bit of history, though, about the education system in Cuba. I'm not used to doing this. I usually do all the behind the scenes stuff. I'd like to give a quick overview on the education in Cuba. 97.5% of children attend school until the age of 14. There are 2.3 million students enrolled in different levels of school. There are 220 institutions of science and technology that employ more than 30,000 workers. There are 1.8 scientists and engineers per 1,000 inhabitants and more than 7,000 PhD holders. There are 69 universities in the country, and 17 are accredited by the Ministry of Higher Education. There are over 21,000 professors employed in these institutions, and 6% of the Cuban population has completed an undergraduate program. All new graduates are granted jobs. They receive their university diploma together with notices of employment. And 1 out of 7 workers in Cuba is a university graduate. API's longest relationship has been with the Universidad de La Havana, and I will focus on that particular university for my talk. But there are several other institutions in which API holds agreements and runs programs through in Havana, and these along with several others in which you can establish your future programs. The Universidad de La Havana is the oldest and most prestigious institution of higher learning in Cuba. As part of the university, there are 14 centers offering studies in specialized areas, as well as 18 different departments. The University of Havana's personnel totals 3,792. Undergraduate students total 14,645, and graduate students total 5,300. There are 23 PhD programs in 21 areas of study. And it's not surprising, given the stature of the amount of programs available, that the university was a pioneer institution in the development of academic exchange between Cuba and the US. To date, the university has signed 444 international agreements with universities throughout the world. It participates in more than 50 international organizations and is part of 35 academic and science networks. There are several areas in which you can establish a relationship, and some options include semester programs, customized programs, short and long research academic training, president, provost, and trustee visits, teaching staff mobility and exchange, joint research projects, and joint articles, joint workshops on special topics, and participation in conferences, seminars, and workshops. I'd like to move on to provide more information regarding how to operate a successful program in Cuba. Before moving forward with any plans to operate a program in Cuba, it is extremely important to consider how much you're willing to invest in training, staffing, and long-term infrastructure. You will need people who can dedicate their time to becoming specialists in managing accounting, logistics, legal, and policy issues both stateside and in Cuba. And as an important aside, it is not possible for US programs to contract Cuban nationals to work for them as resident directors. As such, you have to identify staff who are willing to be able to live outside of their home country for an extended period of time and who possess the skills necessary to acclimate to the new culture. Once you have identified who will be your Cuban specialist or specialist, you can start to identify potential partners for collaboration in Cuba. It's very important to respect the system and the hierarchy of who must be approached first and who you must work through to establish programs in Cuba. Some people have expressed having issues with establishing relationships, but we have never had that experience, but have always gone through the proper channels when setting up our programs. I also believe that we have not had some of the same difficulties as some of the individual universities because we represent so many different university groups and have so many opportunities to continue to interact with our Cuban partners. They see us as a sustainable partner. Most partners in Cuba, like in the US, prefer to enter into formal agreements and sign traditional MOUs before receiving students. These MOUs are often signed in person in Cuba. Until very recently, educational programs were concentrated within Havana. And just recently, the Ministry of Higher Education in Cuba has initiated a process to facilitate short-term and semester programs for North American students outside of Havana. The process is just getting underway, and some details are yet to be determined. If you wish to ultimately set up a program outside of Havana at the university level, the Ministry of Higher Education must first approve such requests. API has started the process through the ministry and is hopeful that we'll be able to launch a program outside of Havana in the near future. Potentially, the opening of other sites within Cuba outside of Havana will allow for greater capacity and increased student exchange. To give you an example of the high level of demand for programs in Cuba, API has had 58 requests this year alone for short-term faculty-led programs in Cuba. Thus far, we've had to only turn away 8 of those because of timetable or the specific nature of the request, and are looking at operating approximately 50 programs over the course of the 2016-2017 academic year for our affiliate universities. The type of academic tracks that you can offer in partnership with Cuban institutions are extensive. The trends that we are seeing include anything from the science to social entrepreneurship, from the sciences to social entrepreneurship and business practices, cultural studies, history, language, as well as architecture and the arts, to name a few. We recently focused on the design of a program in marine biology, which allows U.S. and Cuban faculty to collaborate on areas of mutual research interest. We have been informed that this is a particularly engaging area of study for our Cuban partners, along with business and social entrepreneurship programs. There is room to grow in both of these areas due to shared interest and the needs on the ground. And I'd like to shift gears a little bit to discuss how to obtain the visas necessary for students to attend these educational programs. API has obtained our visas in 2 distinct ways for our students. The first is through the former Cuban interest section and now Cuban embassy. The process is a bit complicated but works very well. First, we send the copies of the student passports to our counterparts at the Universidad de La Havana with the students' program applications. They in turn get a radio number from the Cuban embassy in DC. They then send us the radio number. Students complete the applications. We mail them to DC with the radio number, photo, $70 per participant with a U.S. Postal Service money order only. And we include an express mail for the visas to be returned. If everything is complete, the turnaround time is usually less than a month, and the students will have their visa in time for entry into Cuba. For some of our other programs we operate in Cuba, the Cuban partner institution obtains the visa in Cuba on behalf of API, and a Cuban representative meets our students and U.S. representative at the airport prior to the students going through immigration, literally right after they deplane. And the students then have them for arrival. We always receive a copy of these visas prior to the program start date to give to the travel agency stateside to facilitate the travel on these charter flights. Both processes are relatively seamless, and we have experienced minimal issues. I'd like to end my part of the discussion by reiterating what an exciting time it is to be operating and starting programs in Cuba. All of the efforts and energy that you put into Cuba will be well worth it for both our Cuban counterparts and the U.S. and our students. Anyone who touches a program in Cuba has the opportunity to grow on a personal level. Having been involved in the field of international education for more than 2.5 decades, there has never been another country that I felt offered more meaningful and enriching opportunities for educational people-to-people exchanges. I know that these young students will one day be the leaders of their respective nations and set the policies that shape how our countries relate to one another in the future. To me, each piece of paperwork that we must process, each set of regs that we must seek to understand and assimilate, allows for the personal transformations that take place as a result of operating programs in Cuba. I think that our former students can say it the best, so I'm going to end my section with a quote. This is from one of our students. He said, "I would not change the experience for anything else. My time in Cuba has been amazing. I love the culture, the people, the history," in parentheses, my favorite, has everything, and everything that comes with Cuba is amazing. If I had the chance to study abroad again, I would hands down choose Cuba again. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Mike Eisenberg. He's the president of Educational Travel Alliance and has been working in Cuba since 2001. He specializes in friendship tournaments for athletic teams, most recently the NBA, and university and academic programs, as well as dance, music, and religious groups. He's a very courageous man because he is taking a very large group from the Archdiocese of Boston to Cuba next week for the Pope's visit. And for any of you who have traveled on charter flights to Cuba, he's even more courageous because he's traveled to Cuba over 60 times and dealt with that mess. So, Mike, please.
Well, first of all, Lydia, it's a real pleasure to see you here and not in Havana. The last time we saw each other, there were so many pending projects. We scarcely ever have time to get through the whole list, but somehow or other the projects get done. And, you know, to begin, I want to acknowledge the great support that our organization, and I'm sure lots of organizations, have received from your embassy when it went from your office when it was the intersection, and from the embassy. And it's a real pleasure to look up and see Lynn Roche here. Lynn served in Cuba for 3 years, and the changes that she both participated in and observed are astounding. And it surprises us. Everything that happens in Cuba is a surprise, because what was impossible and unthinkable yesterday, suddenly it happens the next day. And it's never easy. It never goes from point A to point B. It goes from point A to I don't know where to someplace else. It's something extraordinary. I want to say a few words about exchange. In 2000, when we started working in exchange, it was during President Clinton's administration, and it was a shock to the Cubans that we were able to go there. And it was a shock, people-to-people meetings. Can you translate that into Spanish? I mean, what does that mean? You can travel all over the world, and it doesn't say you have to participate in a full-time schedule of people-to-people meetings. This is something that uniquely happened in Cuba because an initiative that President Clinton took, and it really forced organizations like mine to find a way to engage the Cuban people. And anyone who's been involved in travel anywhere knows that the best part is not the Eiffel Tower, it's not the Louvre, it's not the Prado, it's actually connecting with people. And President Clinton's initiative, we felt, was going a long way, and we didn't know the exact words of how to explain it, but little by little it started to happen. Many of the friends that we made back in 2000 are integral to the programs that we offer now. I want to say something about the word exchange. Exchange means something happens both ways. So initially, we only brought people from the US to Cuba on what turned out to be very rich people-to-people programs. Subsequently, we said, you know, we're offered such amazing hospitality here, and we're made to feel so welcome. We have to invite you to come back. And somehow or other, in the beginning, everyone said, because in the beginning, Cubans didn't have passports. Only a very select few would be allowed to leave the country. Approximately 5 years ago, Cubans all were able to get passports. 5 years ago, with the help of people at the intersection, we brought Danza Contemporanea de Cuba from Cuba to the United States for a 2-week tour that included the Joyce Theater in New York and actually the Strand Theater in Boston, for no good reason except that I live there. And it was extraordinary. And to be with these young dancers and watch just their minds open up as they encountered what it's really like to be in the United States, and to see their minds change was something extraordinary. Today, last night, we had a softball team arrive from Cuba. Includes many players from the Cuba big leagues, but they're my age, they're not young guys. We're going down to Cape Cod to play in the Cape Cod Invitational Tournament. They won last year, my team didn't. Hope to reverse it this year. And then today's the 9th. So today, the Malpaso Dance Company is arriving from Cuba. They're going to be in Los Angeles and subsequently in Atlanta. And I want to say that exchange means it happens both ways. And one of the reasons we believe that our programs have been able to have the depth that they have is that it's been both ways. And by having people come from there here, it's really opened up opportunities for us to have deeper and richer exchanges there. So I encourage you, if you want to have a program in Cuba, don't only think about people from the US going. Everything that Jennifer said is true. And I've been involved in international education for more than 40 years. And I didn't get to Cuba until 15 years ago, but I echo everything you said about the experience for students. But it's just very important to realize going there is big. Cubans coming here and going back to Cuba and relating to the Cubans, all the goodwill, the way that we genuinely are here is something extraordinary. I want to say that from, there was a term that we used for a long time in international exchange. It was breaking the ice, because there was ice between two cultures and you had to find a way to break through. In Cuba, there's no ice to break. Cuba's actually we're a nation from immigrants from all over the world. Most of the places you go, France is French, China is China. Cuba is people from all over the world. There are people from Africa. There are people from Spain. And the US, until 1959, had a major cultural impact. And we're used to cultural diversity just the way that they are. So there's no ice to break. And we're just like them. We can't keep our mouths shut. The most popular phrase that you'll hear from a Cuban is, "Don't tell anybody I told you this." So, and what I always say is, "Tell everybody I told you this." So, it's a unique opportunity. I want to say that we were actually. There's no longer a requirement to be a licensed travel service provider. We were licensed by the U.S. government to bring legal groups to Cuba, and we've dealt with lifelong learning organizations, with colleges, with universities, with dance companies, with athletic teams. We're very proud to have taken the NBA there in April. We do a number of what we call embedded courses with universities, where a professor teaches a 11 or 12 or 13-week course, of which 1 week is spent in Cuba to really experience Cuba after having learned about it. And our programs are initiated, and they're done through the institutions that Jennifer spoke of, and professors come and work with the universities, and the professors work on syllabi and things like that before. But those embedded programs, there's no reason for any university not to encourage that. That is something that's fully licensable from the U.S. point of view. It is something that can be arranged by a private organization like mine. The programs are extraordinary, and the difference between just learning about Cuba in the classroom and then actually going there is staggering. I also want to say something about athletic teams. We took an amazing chorus from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It was Voices from the Heart. Yeah, Voices from the Heart. 125 ladies and me. But there's something every summer called every other summer, called Havana. So for the first time ever, a U.S. chorus went and participated in Havana, which had choruses from all over Latin America plus us. These ladies were so talented and sang their hearts out. And every place we went, they sang both the U.S. national anthem and the U.S. national anthem. And I can only tell you I had tears in my eyes because I looked in the audience and saw all the tears in their eyes when the two national anthems were sung by those ladies. This means so much to the Cuban people that they get to see a side of us that we should be very proud of that doesn't come through on the media. And then every year we bring a number of sports teams, any age group. And sports exchanges, again, it's just a great way for people to get to know each other in a cultural exchange that they're comfortable with. That it's not just talk, it's just doing things together. And I just want to finish my remarks by saying that everything is so dynamic in Cuba. Everything is changing. And the rate of change will probably slow down, but it will incorporate so much of the work that we all do. And bridges are built one brick at a time. New relations are not so much built by legislatures in the two countries, but by people who find a meaningful way to interact. And I want to say that I think the current administration's program, foreign policy vis-a-vis Cuba has been enlightened. I think the contributions that I've seen people like Lynn and Lydia and Tim and Conrad have made have been extraordinary. And I think we're not ever going to be in a final place, I don't think, in our relationship with Cuba. But I've seen it, at least in my opinion, from talking to the Cuban people I know, they feel so much better than they did 15 years ago. They're so much more optimistic that their future might be better. And they've always been welcoming, and they feel that their welcoming attitude has been more than reciprocated by us. And I think that's something important. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Before we move on to the next panelist, I just want to remind all of you that you've received a little piece of paper for questions. So if you do have any question for any of the panelists or the panel in general, just make sure to hand it to the staff that's here collecting the questions, and we'll go through those at the end of the panel. Our next panelist is Cynthia Bidari. She's a folklorist at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. She first went to Cuba in 1999 with James Early to this novel idea of proposing to the Ministry of Culture the idea of a Cuba festival. And then over the course of time, she's traveled all over Cuba and advised on the content for the Smithsonian journeys to Cuba. She's currently the program curator for the Smithsonian Folklife Festival on Cuba. So a lot on the cultural side. Welcome, Cynthia.
Buenos dias. First lesson for learning to live and survive in Cuba is always acknowledge the niceties. And you always say good morning, good day, good afternoon to folks when you first meet them. And you need to kind of get rid of your American personal space bubble because everybody will kiss you. And it means absolutely nothing but good morning or good afternoon. I too want to thank all the folks that put this event together because it is an historic moment. It is an important moment, and I think if we do this well, it will set a course in the way our future connections and exchanges go. So it's very important that we not just be there, but that we be there in some sort of substantive fashion and do things well. I want to acknowledge all of the folks from the State Department that have helped us through since '99, since I've been traveling there. Doing this, we've learned a lot of names and faces and have gone through different tenures of folks being there. And just when we feel really at home and comfortable with one set of folks, you get cycled out and we get to meet another wonderful set of folks that have been very helpful in this process. So for us, it's very important to have that kind of support in doing the work. All of our work is complicated as it is on our side, but when you add the bureaucracies on both sides and logistics, it makes, you have to do work in order to do the work. So that kind of support is critically important to us. Like you said, in 1999, James Early, my longtime colleague and friend and family member from the Smithsonian, who was at the time Director of Cultural Heritage Policy, approached me about going to Cuba. I thought it was a really wonderful idea, just the thought of going to Cuba and doing a Folklife Festival project. And I'm really impressed to hear kind of your visions and your philosophies about the way you do your work, because that's precisely the way the Smithsonian Folklife Festival approaches things, and the kind of deep engagement and substantive engagement and reciprocity are so critical to this. And I think that speaks a lot to the success of being able to have a long-term sustainable project in Cuba. So we thought that Cuba would be a wonderful idea for a Folklife Festival. How many of you have been to the festival? If you haven't, you need to go out and do it every summer. It becomes a local tradition for you. But we've done this kind of work that's now being coined people to people long before we knew the term was people to people. The Smithsonian Festival is designed by intent to do this. So we thought Cuba was a perfect idea. And I was really amazed on this first meeting. James and I go in there, and they sit all these kind of very protocol, very administrative type meetings, and we go from meeting to meeting to meeting. And I think I technically overdosed on Cuban coffee over the first few days because at every meeting there was Cuban coffee. At one point they have a presentation for what they're doing in the field that's parallel to what we do. And I remember leaning over to James and telling him, James, we have nothing to offer these folks, because I was absolutely blown away by the quality of